As we have mentioned, we have part 2 of the third position that has to be input into the system.
Now, the third position basically is a new ideological adaptation of the old story, namely fascism. We're not talking about the Kama Sutra here when we talk about the third position. We're talking specifically about a new, actually it's not that new. In fact, it actually represents a fairly old historical trend going back specifically to the Gregor Strasser wing of the early Nazi Party of Germany, the early NSDAP. The third position specifically aims at uniting left or liberal elements with overt fascist elements in the right under a united banner which essentially will work the fascist program. It ostensibly aims at uniting both the far right and the far left in a common struggle. The end result of their particular program, however, winds up looking, at least their proposed program, winds up looking suspiciously like that desired by the far right all along, i.e. Nazism. Tonight we're going to begin by taking a look at some interesting goings-on which happened in the country right during the Democratic Convention. We're going to ruminate about that. The P word, provocation, is going to be front and center. We're going to talk about the people that the Christic Institute referred to as the secret team. We're going to talk about Brother Farrakhan, friend of the black man, perhaps, or perhaps not, as we've been speculating. And we're going to talk then at great length about the fascist third position. Specifically this evening, we're going to enter into our archives for taping and subsequent use as an audio study resource the entire cover story from the May 1987 issue of Mother Jones. It's an article called Europe's New Fascists by Marty Lee and Kevin Coogan, and we're going to talk about that this evening. We're going to read the whole article into the archives. We're going to move fairly briskly through the actual article because it is self-explanatory. There will be a little bit of interpolative discussion, but not much, because we do want to move through this quickly so we can get time for phone calls. However, it is time to get this stuff, we feel, on tape. And events of the last week have highlighted the importance of understanding the political dynamics of the third position in order to perhaps correctly gauge our, at the very least, gauge our awareness for the upcoming presidential campaign.
That's right. And one last thing to remember, while the third position is being held up by many, especially its advocates, as being a new thing, just remember how the Nazis came to power. They devoured from within the dying body of a socialist group, the National Socialists, and in fact painted themselves in their earliest days as being the better answer to socialism, being the working man's best friend, etc., etc.
In fact, Hitler was selected as der Führer in no small measure because of his background as a commoner, quote-unquote. The Führer was to come from der Volk in order to appeal specifically to populist and disaffected left-wing elements. Perhaps it's worth going into it we'll wait till we get to the Europe's New Fascists and we'll talk about Strasser.
That's right. We're going to talk about not only something that's going to perhaps impact the election, but we're going to talk about one of our own commoners, a common boy made good, the man who put a lump in all of our throats in his testimony and reminded us of why we feel so darn good to be Americans in this election year, of course referring to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. And with the article we're going to be reading is from the San Jose Mercury News for Thursday, July 21st, 1988. The article is headlined, 8-aided Libya, FBI says, subheaded one link to plot on Oliver North.
Might be interesting to read the article which is right above it, just by way of noting the physical association between the two of them, because we might talk a little bit about that too. Yeah, the headline and the story immediately adjacent to that one.
Yes, well, there's a couple of things, but the big headline across the page, of course, is Dukakis's marathon finally ends. California pushes nominee over the top, and of course, so the headline article, this is the morning after the Democratic Convention, where Michael Dukakis, amidst displays of brotherhood and friendship with Lloyd Benson, Jesse Jackson, and others, accepted the Democratic nomination to run, of course, against the all but certain Republican nominee, one George Bush, late vice president and a former head of the CIA and a good buddy of Oliver North, who we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, this is a really interesting tangle. Now, one of the things we've been talking about, and by the way, our original archives, our original broadcast on Election 88, where you heard me pretending I was a ticker tape there, a news bleeper, I don't even know what those things are called, that is on permanent file with archives on audio for people who might want to reference back. For some time we've been talking about not only the use of terrorism to drive people to the right, again, our old provocation scenario, but specifically, perhaps, coming up, coinciding coincidentally with the beginning of the presidential campaign will be the Olympics in South Korea, home of APACL, the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, a main element of WACL, stomping ground of the Moonies and a lot of other unsavory types with very strong connections to the more conservative or more reactionary elements of our national security establishment, explicitly fascist elements. And we've speculated about the possibility of terrorism being used basically as a major element of the push for Bush. Now, George Bush was director of the CIA in 1976 when the Wilson-Turple operation to infiltrate and train not only Muammar Gaddafi's terrorist cadre, but those of a lot of other European and Asian terrorist groups, including the Irish Republican Army, most notably the Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army faction, Baader-Meinhof gang, Carlos the Jackal, and others, and the, lest we forget, the Turkish Grey Wolves. This began when George Bush was CIA director. In the Sheehan affidavit put out by the Christic Institute, it appears that much of this continued apace under the table. And we've also talked about the Tawana Brawley case in New York and the role played in the Tawana Brawley case by, among others, Reverend Al Sharpton, a reputed CIA agent, a self-admitted FBI informer, and a strange fellow who has begun heating the political pot in the New York area and on the national scene over the Tawana Brawley case, also conveniently obscuring the actual facts of the case. We've also talked about the role in the Tawana Brawley case of followers of the Reverend Louis Farrakhan. And we've also talked in the past, and we're going to review tonight, connections between Farrakhan and Muammar Gaddafi and the Aryan nations. And all of these elements are coming into focus in an interesting sort of way because just as the Democrats were having their convention and just as Jesse Jackson was being incorporated into the mainstream of the party, this is the same Jesse Jackson previously associated with Louis Farrakhan and still associated to some extent in some people's minds with Louis Farrakhan, who should turn up what to our wondering eyes should appear, so to speak, but 8 tiny reindeer driven by Madman Mo, or so we're told.
Indeed. 8-8 Libya, FBI says, one link to plot on Oliver North. This, again, is a Mercury News Wire Services story for Thursday, July 21st. FBI agents Wednesday arrested 8 men involved in pro-Libyan activities in the United States on charges that they had diverted funds to promote the Muammar Gaddafi regime. And federal sources said one of them had been linked to a potential assassination plot against former White House aide Oliver North. North, as a National Security Council aide, helped plan the 1986 U.S. bombing of Tripoli. Quote, "The threat took place some time ago and obviously was never carried out," said a department official who asked not to be named. Another of those arrested, a government source said, is suspected of providing his country with lists of U.S. government sources, lists of U.S. government sources said, is suspected of providing his country, they wrote it twice. He's suspected of providing his country with lists of U.S. government workers as possible targets for Libyan retribution after the bombing, which reportedly took the life of an infant daughter of Libyan strongman Gaddafi. But officials familiar with the evidence said they doubted the government would be able to lodge more than the illegal diversion charge, which carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. Quote, a, quote, number of American Indians and black Muslims, unquote, were among those whose travel expenses to Libya allegedly were paid from Libyan funds sent to the McLean, Virginia-based People's Committee for Libyan Students, according to an FBI affidavit filed in Alexandria, Virginia. It should be very interesting that they happen to be set up in McLean, Virginia.
That's one of the major Islamic epicenters in the New World.
Right, yes. It's
literally, actually.
Yeah, you're hard pressed to walk down the streets of McLean, Virginia, and not bump into a CIA case officer.
Yeah, they sell gold-bound copies of the Quran down at the local 5 and 10 cent store.
That's right. The McLean, Virginia-based People's Committee for Libyan Students, according to an FBI affidavit filed in Alexandria, Virginia. The committee was set up to provide financial support for about 200 Libyan students in the United States. The disclosure of the alleged assassination plot came at a magistrate's hearing for 6 of the suspects in Alexandria, as U.S. Attorney Henry E. Hudson reacted to indications that the suspects would be released without bond. He gave no details of the plot or its target, but Magistrate Leonie Brinkema promptly ordered the men held without bail until a hearing Friday. At congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra affair a year ago, North testified that he had been alerted by the FBI in April 1987 that a threat had been made against his life by Abu Nidal, the Palestinian terrorist leader who has strong ties to Gaddafi. The threat came in a videotaped interview in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, in which a Nidal aide said that North had been placed on a hit list because of the bombing, along with other Americans involved in anti-terrorist activities. North testified that as a result he accepted a home security system that cost $15,984 from retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord, now a co-defendant of North in the Iran-Contra case. From April 8th to October 1st, 1987, North was constantly guarded by agents from the Naval Investigative Service and subsequently has been accompanied by private security agents. At the hearing, Hudson said one of the men charged, Musa Hawamda, owner of the Manara Travel Agency in Washington, was involved in, quote, a potential plot to assassinate a high government official of the United States, unquote. Hawamda, age 42, holds both U.S. and Jordanian passports, Hudson said. Hudson also charged that Saleh Mohammed Ghima al-Raji, a Moroccan citizen who is another of the suspects, had provided the Libyan government with a list of federal officials who may have been involved in the Libyan bombing, possibly as retaliation targets. Hudson described the case as, quote, rare and, quote, sensitive, and said it involved national security. Well, obviously it does involve national security, and it could be the rareness and sensitivity of this case might be something on a par with the Reichstag fire. We have talked at great length a few weeks ago, as Dave mentioned during the Election 88 theme show, about the possibility that the American elections, among other things, the trial of Oliver North and the Olympics are all going to be coming down in a fairly short period from one another. And as we've seen a bunch of terrorist groups that haven't bothered to show their pointy little heads for some years suddenly popping up, the Japanese Red Army and others, trolling up and down the turnpikes of Washington, D.C. with cars packed full of bombs and showing up in Korea and all kinds of other places. Now we're hearing about Louis Farrakhan's buddy Muammar Gaddafi. He's going to make an attempt, apparently, or was thinking about it, to kill Oliver North.
Through Abu Nidal.
Through Abu Nidal, which, as Dave will mention in a second, is a rather interesting confluence of circumstances. Anyway, we have to wonder if George's recent Newsweek polls, which show him trailing the most recent one right after the Democratic Convention, trailing Michael Dukakis by about 17%. If there's a little thought in the Bush camp that it's time to call in people like Miles Copeland, the former CIA agent who said, hey, all us CIA guys are rooting for Bush. We're going to do whatever we can do to help him get elected. He's the only man who understands how America's covert policy should be carried out.
Push for Bush.
Push for Bush. Yeah, why don't we tell the folks, just before we go on, a little bit about Abu Nidal and Oliver North.
All righty, and then after that we'll talk about Louis Farrakhan and some of the interesting things. Now, Oliver North is an interesting person to be worried about threats from Abu Nidal because they have a couple of things in common other than just enmity or apparent enmity. Namely, they have a thing in common known as Mansour al-Qassar. Now, Mansour al-Qassar is an international weapons and drug dealer of Syrian descent, somewhat like another Syrian named Henry Arsan, who we've talked about in some of these same contexts. He was the fellow who was responsible to a certain extent for brokering the weapons shipment that traveled over to Central America on the Iria. This is one of the major transactions. Now, Mansour al-Qassar is also a weapons supplier, not only for Abu Nidal, the fellow who is supposedly threatening Oliver North's life here, but also for Abu Abbas, the fellow who staged the Achille Lauro hijacking, that one of a number of terrorist incidents which had projected Oliver North further into the inner sanctum of the U.S. National Security Council and the U.S. National Security Establishment in general. Now, one of the interesting things is that the Abu Abbas group, among others, has interesting ties to explicit Nazi elements. We've talked about the Ottfried Hepp situation, Ottfried Hepp being one of Germany's top neo-Nazis, an affiliate of the Abbas group, and someone that Oliver North wanted, or that the Abu Abbas group wanted released as a condition for releasing the Achille Lauro. We talked about that on Radio Free America show number 32. And another interesting aspect of the Iria connection is that the weapons firm used to broker a large amount of these sales was brokered by a company called Merex. And this brings up another interesting Nazi connection. The Merex corporation that was involved is not only a West German armaments maker allied with the Skorzeny arms empire and run by a former Skorzeny associate and BND operative named Gerhard Mertens, who's an interesting fellow, but more importantly, perhaps for our purposes here, among the people that had acted as a downlink for the Merex arms shipments in the past was a fellow named Guido Giannettini, who operated on behalf of Merex and the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the fourth and final, actually, incarnation of the Galen spy organization, to ship weapons to the Italian far right. Guido Giannettini was also a member of the P2 Lodge and explicitly a member of the third position branch of the P2 Lodge. Again, Guido Giannettini acting for Merex, itself a BND front, and the same West German arms shipper that was responsible for the Urea deal. And again, even though many of the main Third Reich alumni have moved out of the U.S. national security establishment, many of them do remain, and the effects of their activities remain in a big, big way. So the Abu Nidal threatening Oliver North here is really interesting, considering that they belong to part of the same network. And we have Oliver North talking about the Rex 84 martial law plan, and yet at the same time we have him dealing with people like Mansour el-Qassar to bring weapons to the United States. And the Mansour el-Qassar situation, the Merex situation, directly anticipates the main subject of tonight's broadcast, which is the fascist third position. Now, Louis Farrakhan's group is the group that has been cooperating with Gaddafi to a certain extent in sending some of the members of its organization to the Middle East to work in Libya. That was talked about in the San Jose Mercury News article that Nip read just a couple of minutes ago. More on the association between Farrakhan and Gaddafi, and perhaps more significantly for our purposes, on the relationship between Farrakhan and the Aryan nations is discussed right here. This is an article from the Spokane Regional, and this was gleaned for us by a listener. This is from the Spokane Regional for Sunday, December 20th of 19... Actually, this is the Spokane Regional, which appears to be part of the Spokane Chronicle. It says the Spokesman Review Spokane Chronicle. So I'm not totally sure what the title of the paper is. I'm not familiar with the Spokane region. I think this is the Spokane Chronicle, though, or perhaps the Spokesman Review and Spokane Chronicle. And this is the Spokane Regional section. At any rate, Sunday, December 20th of 1987. This is by Bill Moreland, a staff writer. It's called Wiretaps Unveil Neo-Nazi Generals, subheaded Butler identified as a commander of racist group's criminal activities, talking, of course, about the Aryan Nations neo-Nazi group. Telephone wiretaps and an electronic bug planted in a home were used by the FBI as part of its nationwide investigation of racists accused of plotting a revolution, newly released court documents reveal. Aryan Nations leader Richard Butler is identified in the documents as one of 5 neo-Nazi generals in the United States who continued to command criminal activities, unquote, of the order. Butler branded that as baloney and said Friday, the FBI still hasn't got anything on me, unquote. I'm not a general of anything unless it's a general flunky around the office here, the white separatist said when contacted at Aryan Nations headquarters near Hayden Lake, Idaho. The documents offer tantalizing new information about the domestic terrorist group that has been under FBI investigation since 1984. Highlights include evidence that the order, using the code designation 33-5, continued to function long after more than 24 of its members were imprisoned on racketeering and other criminal charges. Details that the order planned to bomb federal buildings in 5 major cities and plotted to free order members David Tate and David Lane from prisons in the Midwest. And last, but certainly not least, reports in 1985 that Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi wished to channel money to the Aryan Nations through the Nation of Islam, a black Muslim separatist sect headed by Louis Farrakhan of Chicago. Now, in Radio Free America number 13, we talked about Louis Farrakhan's affiliations with Aryan Nations member and Klansman Robert Miles of Michigan. He attended an Aryan Nations conference, and he is generally held in high regard by the Aryan Nations and has actually associated with them in the past. Bear in mind, this is an organization, at least the order, advocates the extermination of black people and awards points to its members for doing just that. It's an interesting group of people for Louis Farrakhan to be associated with. In the New York Times write-up on this roundup of the Libyans, it specifically talks about the Louis Farrakhan organization, the Nation of Islam, as being the group that sent the black Muslim students to Libya. So specifically linking Farrakhan's name with Gaddafi in this terrorism at the time of the Democratic Convention is interesting. There are file photos, incidentally, of Jesse Jackson with Gaddafi, and those could make excellent campaign grist for the Bush PR mills, particularly in light of this sort of thing. Now, bear in mind, in September, that's the first month of the presidential campaign. It's also when the Olympics are going to be going on in South Korea. It also is when Oliver North's trial is scheduled to start, and this could be pretty interesting. One wonders if perhaps this, the breaking of this terrorist story at this time was used specifically to link in people's minds the Democrats with terrorism. In Radio Free America 23, we looked at the same thing. In the 1972 Republican convention, the Watergate burglars apparently were attempting to plant information in the Democratic National Committee offices, which would have linked the Democrats to left-wing terrorism and so forth. We looked at this in our material from the Glass House tapes. Again, RFA number 23 is the reference. And one wonders if this is sort of a sympathy bid or a PR device to begin engendering sympathy for Ollie North, the Contra supply crew, who, of course, would include, eventually, George Bush.
Yeah, just posit a scenario, if you will, that we're in September. Not only are there terrorist attacks at the Olympics where, maybe athletes are killed, innocent spectators are killed, the radical left, as supported not only by the North Korean communists, but also supported by people like Muammar Gaddafi, are nailed as being responsible. Maybe even somebody attempts to kill Oliver North as he goes on trial, and the Democrats are branded as being the party of Jesse Jackson, Louis Farrakhan, and Muammar Gaddafi, et cetera, and then the economy falls apart, and who's sitting there nursing his wounds from the terrorist attack but Oliver North, just like Hitler after the putsch, just waiting around to be brought out of retirement and thrust into the limelight to reluctantly take on his shoulders the position of bringing this country back to what it stands for, what all those Minutemen and Klansmen and all these people have been telling us about for years: clean, white, American, Aryan, capitalism. And Oliver will just be waiting around. He'll look real good with a little limp, as he comes up to the podium to accept the kingship of the United States.
Like Hitler, he's the commoner rising to greatness in order to fulfill the call to national honor.
That's right.
Very similar type of role. Nip, why don't I put the tape on hold while we give an ID here?
All right, sounds like a good idea. And we should mention that broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC, Los Altos Hills. We're going to read now from, at great length, but it's an excellent and very important article from the piece we had discussed earlier, which is the cover story for Mother Jones magazine of May of 1987. The article is Europe's New Fascists on the cover. On the inside of the magazine, the article itself is titled Killers on the Right Inside Europe's Fascist Underground. The article is by Martin A. Lee and Kevin Coogan. We used Martin Lee's book, the Acid Dreams, by Martin Lee and
Martin Lee and Bruce Schlane.
Bruce Schlane, thank you. We have quoted at some length on the show, and we've also used...
Yeah, in fact, we used large sections of it. We based most of RFA 28 on that book.
That's right, and we've also seen other stuff of Martin Lee and Kevin Coogan's, I think some stuff that we've seen in the Village Voice and elsewhere. And
not only the Village Voice, which we used in our Pope shooting series, specifically RFA number 21, but also in our in number 19 was some of the material from a Martin Lee article on the Knights of Malta called There Will Be Done from
That's right.
either May or June of 1983.
Also from Mother Jones, as I recall.
Yep. Cover story also.
Again, we're reading from Killers on the Right. It's a longish article, and Dave and I are going to be passing it back and forth. It's subheaded Inside Europe's Fascist Underground. It's a cold, wet night, the kind that southern England is famous for. Outside the U.S. Air Force Base in Lakenheath, the base from which fighter planes will take off several months later on their way to bomb the Libyan capital of Tripoli, 100 young activists are picketing with signs and banners. Thrusting their fists into the air, they take up a rousing, if unimaginative, chant, "Yanks out! Yanks out!" But these protesters are not the anti-nuke people or the left-wing radicals who typically march for peace in Britain. They are members of the National Front, the country's main neo-Nazi organization. And it's not nuclear arms that upset them so, but rather American nuclear arms. Quote, "The National Front," explains the organization's magazine, Nationalism Today, says no to U.S. bases in Britain, no to crews, and no to our ancient and proud nation serving as a pawn for the alien overlords of an upstart Coca-Cola republic. We want a Britain strong and free with our own independent nuclear deterrent, which alone will enable us to keep out of the superpowers' suicidal schemes," unquote. The National Front is not alone. Across Western Europe, a new breed of right-wing militant has been born, a violent brotherhood that holds regular paramilitary camps where young recruits are indoctrinated in racist lore and weapons training. These neo-Nazi fanatics have been at the forefront of anti-black, anti-Asian, anti-Arab, and anti-immigrant violence throughout the continent. They hate the NATO alliance and what the British fascists call the, quote, United States of America. And they are responsible for hundreds of terrorist attacks, including many of the bloodiest outrages on the continent in recent years. The Reagan administration would have us believe otherwise. Intent on furthering a Cold War agenda, U.S. government officials consistently ignore the activity of neo-Nazi agitators, preferring instead to portray Moscow and its Arab allies as the driving forces behind an elaborate world terrorist network. But a closer look reveals that the secret killers of the European right are major promoters of international terrorism, the indiscriminate murder of innocent civilians for political purposes. These right-wingers have bombed NATO bases and murdered American GIs stationed in Western Europe. They have provided logistical support, arms, and financial counsel to the most extreme Arab terrorists, including those involved in the Black September organization and in the Achille Lauro hijacking. And perhaps most surprisingly, they are now collaborating with left-wing terrorists in Europe. The confluence of the far left and far right involves members of the Carlos Network, France's Direct Action, and West Germany's Red Army faction, along with two key figures, a mysterious left-wing attorney from France and a shadowy Swiss banker who worships Adolf Hitler. The two men have played a key role in forging an alliance between the two extremes, and together they personify one of the slogans of what has come to be called the, quote, third position. Hitler and Mao united in struggle.
Continuing with Kevin Coogan and Marty Lee's Europe's New Fascist, cover story of the May 1987 issue of Mother Jones magazine. The events of August 2nd, 1980, are emblazoned like a scar on the Italian psyche. It was the first day of summer vacation for millions of Italians, and Bologna's central railway station was crammed with holiday travelers. At exactly 10:25 a.m., a bomb exploded inside the station, ripping apart the concrete walls and bringing the roof down on the crowd. As rescue crews labored to pull the mangled bodies from the wreckage, a young neo-fascist telephoned Bologna's leading newspaper, quote, "This is the armed revolutionary nuclei," he announced. "We claim responsibility for the explosion in the train station," unquote. This was not the first time right-wing terrorists had struck in Italy, nor would it be the last. But the Bologna bombing, which killed 85 people and injured over 200, was by far the most devastating act of terror in post-war Europe. To maximize the carnage, the armed revolutionary nuclei had deliberately chosen the busiest time of year in one of Italy's busiest train stations to launch its attack. And Bologna was targeted for another reason as well. It is the heart of the country's Red Belt, a swath of fertile farmland and mid-sized cities in central Italy that has been a stronghold of the Italian Communist Party since World War II. NAR was formed in 1977 and attracted many young militants who had grown impatient with the Italian social movement, MSI, the legal fascist party that had claimed 400,000 members and several seats in parliament by the mid-1970s. The armed revolutionary nuclei dismissed the MSI's participation in parliament and ridiculed the MSI's lip service to democratic ideals. The MSI was also considered suspect by the young fascists because of its cozy relationship with Washington. MSI chief Giorgio Almirante, who had served in Benito Mussolini's cabinet during World War II, held high-level talks with members of the National Security Council under the Nixon administration. A congressional investigation later revealed that Graham Martin, the U.S. ambassador in Rome, had passed large sums of money in the early 1970s to the head of the Italian Secret Service, who in turn was closely identified with the MSI. I would interrupt very briefly. One thing that Lee and Coogan do not talk about in this article is the connection both of the armed revolutionary nuclei and the MSI to the P2 Lodge of Licio Gelli, the crypto-fascist government basically running Italy for about the last 20 years or so.
NAR was formed in 1977 and attracted many young militants who had grown impatient with the Italian social movement, MSI. The legal fascist party that had claimed 400,000 members and several seats in parliament by the mid-1970s. The armed revolutionary nuclei dismissed the MSI's participation in Parliament and ridiculed the MSI's lip service to democratic ideals. The MSI was also considered suspect by the young fascists because of its cozy relationship with Washington. MSI chief Giorgio Almirante, who had served in Benito Mussolini's cabinet during World War II, held high-level talks with members of the National Security Council under the Nixon administration. A congressional investigation later revealed that Graham Martin, the U.S. ambassador in Rome, had passed large sums of money in the early 1970s to the head of the Italian Secret Service, who in turn closely identified with the MSI. Like their fascist elders, NAR militants were staunchly anti-communist. At the same time, they were vehemently opposed to the cultural and political domination of Western Europe. I'm just lost myself here. Where did it go? Okay, there it is. I'll start it again. Like their fascist elders, NAR militants were staunchly anti-communist. At the same time, they were vehemently opposed to the cultural and political domination of Western Europe by the United States. They advocated a third position, the rejection of both superpower blocs in favor of an independent Europe, stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. The clandestine NAR served as the armed wing of an above-ground organization called Terza Posizione, third position, with NAR members carrying out bank robberies, jewelry heists, and weapons raids to raise money for, quote, the movement. Third position activists espoused a bizarre Nazi Maoist doctrine which would soon become the dominant ideology among neo-Nazis throughout Western Europe. They adopted an incongruous set of heroes, Hitler, Mao, Gaddafi, and Perón, and shouted slogans like, "Long live the fascist dictatorship of the proletariat," and "Hitler and Mao united in struggle." A leading Italian neo-Nazi terrorist, Stefano Della Chiai, even wrote a letter to Gaddafi urging him to join in a common struggle against, quote, atheistic Soviet Marxism and American capitalist materialism, unquote, both of which were controlled by, quote, international Zionism. The young NAR militants embraced the traditional fascist view of combat as an existential duty and of violence as a self-purifying aesthetic. They exploded onto the scene in December 1977 by bombing the Rome headquarters of both the Christian Democratic Party and the Communist Party, the Italian proxies to the neo-fascist mind of U.S. and Soviet imperialism. They followed that up by storming a progressive radio station in Rome and machine-gunning 5 housewives who were taking part in an on-air discussion about feminism. In the late 1970s, NAR members also engaged in running street battles with left-wing activists, resulting in numerous casualties on both sides. Curiously, the authorities were slow to react to neo-fascist violence, even though by 1979 there had been 400 attacks by right-wing extremists in Italy, the most terror-ridden country on the continent, since the late 1960s. In stark contrast to the massive police drive in the late 1970s against the left-wing Red Brigades, right-wing terrorism went virtually unpunished, at least until third-position leaders began to make peace overtures to far-left groups who hated the Soviet Union for what they saw as selling out the world revolution. This shared antipathy toward the United States and the Soviet Union set the stage for dialogue between the two extremes.
As the 1970s drew to a close, the word began sifting through neo-fascist circles in Italy to avoid clashes with the Red Brigades and other left-wing militants. The new third position strategy was to encourage left and right-wing rebels to link up in a common effort to destroy the state. This was a period of great change for the right wing, an NAR cell chief later told an Italian judge. Quote, new ideas and new needs sprang up. We changed our attitude toward the ultra-left-wing groups. The guy with the long hair was no longer our enemy. We realized that we were victims of the same system, and we started to grow our hair long and use the same terminology that was typical of the extreme left wing. Note this last sentence again. The guy with the long hair was no longer our enemy. We realized that we were victims of the same system, and we started to grow our hair long and use the same terminology that was typical of the extreme left wing. We felt a generational bond with left-wing youth, and we appreciated their anti-bourgeois attitude. We understood that left and right-wing revolutionaries had to stop killing each other, unquote. As part of its attempted opening to the left, the third position articulated a broad political program on everything from ecology to women's rights, and fashioned itself as the champion of young people on the margins of society. In June of 1980, countercultural themes were celebrated at a 3-day fascist jamboree called Camp Hobbit, unquote, named after the world of fantasy and magic evoked by the J.R.R. Tolkien novels. Some 2,500 right-wingers from throughout Western Europe converged on the picturesque Apennine mountains in Italy's Abruzzi region for a weekend quite different from the paramilitary camps many were used to attending. Here they ate health food, attended workshops on Nordic mythology and the Holy Grail, and listened to musicians sing about the problems of being a full-time revolutionary and the impending glory of a united Europe free from U.S. and Soviet control. Mingling freely among the crowd on the invitation of camp organizers were reporters from left-wing newspapers, magazines, and radio stations who eavesdropped while the devotees of Middle-earth debated the correct political and metaphysical line.
The young fascists hoped to make their idyllic romp in the woods an annual event, but those plans came crashing down 6 weeks later, along with the roof of the Bologna train station. The bombing prompted a long-overdue police crackdown on the ultra-right, and an initial police sweep netted 200 Italian fascists, neo-fascists, in the late summer of 1980. By this time, according to the imprisoned right-wing pentiti, or penitents, who agreed to share information with police, NAR and some of its left-wing counterparts had called to a halt the street fighting that had taken many lives during the previous decade. When police raided a safe house operated by neo-fascist militant Egidio Giuliani in 1981, they found evidence that Giuliani had supplied weapons and phony papers to extremists at both ends of the political spectrum, including members of Prima Linea, a far-left terrorist group.
Recall in the first part of the third position, we took a look at some Italian translations from Dave, our translator, dealing with not only the Giuliani's connections with the government and right and left-wing terrorism, but also connections to, among other things, Stiebaum and the Aldo Moro killing.
When a Prima Linea militant was wounded during a bank robbery, Giuliani secured a hideout in Rome to facilitate his recovery. Giuliani was one of 57 suspects named in a 1985 indictment by Italian magistrates investigating the Bologna massacre. 20 of the 57 began standing trial on March 2nd of this year. Several weeks after the Bologna bombing, third position organizer Roberto Fiore led a group of Italian neo-fascists fleeing to London, where they were provided with shelter by members of the National Front. The 28-year-old Fiore was a suspect in the Bologna bombing and later was convicted in absentia for belonging to a subversive organization. Yet efforts by Italian authorities to extradite him failed on procedural grounds, and today he walks the streets of London a free man. When Fiore arrived in Britain, the National Front was in turmoil. Its electoral fortunes had plummeted since the peak year of 1977, when it polled 230,000 votes, largely because Margaret Thatcher's Tory party had appropriated one of its main policies, opposition to foreign immigration. The Front needed a new strategy. With Fiore as its political mentor, a hardline faction started pushing a British version of the third position. The group set out to transform the Front into an elite terrorist organization modeled after Italy's NAR, with paramilitary training for selected members, led by a former member of the South African Army. Other British neo-Nazis had held secret guerrilla warfare camps throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s in northern England, where fascists from Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and other countries joined their British brethren in practicing night combat and ambush drills. For spiritual guidance, young National Front recruits were given copies of a new journal, Rising. The journal featured frequent backward glances at a golden age when broad-boned, gallant warriors rode out to slay the infidels, a vision that contrasts sharply with a motley array of skinhead hooligans who made up the bulk of the new recruits. Following the Italian example, the National Front started making overtures to the left. Front members began to show up at meetings of civil liberties and animal rights organizations. They joined protests against acid rain, and their newspaper began to feature a regular Greens column, meaning, in quotes, they're talking about green as in the Green Party in Europe, especially in Germany.
Ecology Party.
Yes. National Front militants even tried to set up a minor strike support group before that bitter strike ended last year.
All this was a bit too much for the more traditional British Nazis, who preferred slugging it out with the Pinkos rather than mimicking their causes. After a bitter power struggle, the Old Guard was ousted from the National Front in 1984. They retaliated by lashing out at the third position leaders, accusing them of making secret deals with the Libyan embassy in London. Secret deals or no, the front clearly is friendly with Libya. The British anti-fascist magazine Searchlight, which monitors the activities of neo-Nazis in Western Europe, says Libya financed an anti-Semitic broadsheet put out by the front. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi is applauded in National Front literature, as is American black Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan, whose anti-Semitism and message of racial separation appeal to many neo-Nazis. But the National Front reserves its most effusive praise for the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Their belief in their cause is so strong that they will run through minefields unarmed to attack enemy positions. Their ideals are so all-consuming that they will drive truck bombs into enemy camps knowing full well that death is inevitable. This power, this contempt for death, is the stuff of which victories are made." Unquote. Ironically, Gaddafi, Farrakhan, and Khomeini are, by culture and skin coloring, exactly the kinds of people the National Front would like to see banned from immigrating to Britain. If politics makes strange bedfellows, a new cliché will have to be invented to describe the improbable alliance between far-left French lawyer Jacques Vergès and old guard Nazi François Genoud. That's Genoud. Thanks to their partnership, Vergès will step into a Parisian courtroom in May to defend Klaus Barbie, who is charged with crimes against humanity, unquote, and who is said to have killed 4,000 non-Jewish French people and deported 7,000 Jews to death camps during his World War tenure as chief of the Gestapo in Lyon. The Barbie affair is the latest collaboration between Vergès and Genoud, who have each been linked to some of the major terrorist dramas of recent years. A half-dozen statues of the Buddha adorn the spacious Paris law office of Jacques Vergès, the son of a French father and a Vietnamese mother. A large marble chessboard dominates one corner. During our interview, Vergès is part Buddha and part chess master, now cool and detached, now attentive and calculating. As he peers at us through round, rimless spectacles, he speaks freely of the upcoming trial of Klaus Barbie and says virtually nothing about his relationship with banker François Genoud, who is helping pay the costs of Barbie's legal defense.
A week later, a well-dressed older man scurries toward us, pigeon-toed, and in a single motion clicks his heels together, reaches for a handshake, and announces, "I am François Genoud." He snaps his fingers to usher us into the lobby of the Beau Rivage, a luxury hotel in Lausanne overlooking Lake Geneva. He snaps his fingers again, and a round of drinks appears. After we promise not to quote him for publication, he launches into a frenetic 90-minute tirade, sprinkled with non-sequiturs, about U.S. and Soviet imperialism, the arrogance of Israel, blacks in Parliament, and the sorry state of the world since the death of his beloved Führer in 1945. But Genoud, who, according to author Ernest Paris, Unhealed Wounds is the book, owns all the posthumous rights to the writings of Hitler, the Führer's private secretary Martin Bormann, and Third Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Genoud is no comic opera Nazi. In his early 20s, he was a member of the Swiss Nazi Party, and he later worked for German intelligence during World War II. After the war, Genoud's work on behalf of imprisoned German war criminals won him the public praise of SS General Karl Wolff, the former right-hand man of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. The consummate behind-the-scenes operator, Genoud saw the benefits of courting Arab and far-left groups long before the third position emerged in Italy. Ironically, this spiritual predecessor of the thugs who now attack NATO bases and rail against the Jew-United States of America joined a contingent of 200 Nazis, led by the legendary Otto Scarface Skorzeny, who were stationed in Egypt during the mid-1950s at the behest of the CIA. Their assignment, according to State Department documents cited by Skorzeny's biographer Glenn B. Infield, was to help President Gamal Abdel Nasser reorganize the Egyptian military and Secret Service. The CIA believed that these Nazi operatives would block any Egyptian overtures to the Soviet Union, but the Nazis saw a more immediate foe than the Red Menace. Soon they were training an Arab Foreign Legion, as well as the first Palestinian terrorists, who would undertake commando raids against Israel from the Gaza Strip.
While in Egypt, Junot befriended the leaders of the Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, who were fighting to free their country from French colonial rule. His financial acumen and political connections made him a valuable asset to the Arab revolutionaries. As Erna Paris has pointed out, he created an import-export firm called Arabo-Africa to deliver weapons to the FLN, set up the Arab Commercial Bank in Switzerland, and manage the FLN's war chest until Algeria gained its independence in 1962. 2 years later, Junot and the FLN had a major falling out, and for the next 15 years they battled in Swiss courts for control of a $15 million FLN Swiss bank account until the money was returned to Algeria. At the height of the Algerian War in the late 1950s, Junot first met Jacques Vergès. The Algerian resistance held great emotional appeal for Vergès, who fought the battles of the Third World through his legal practice. One of his most famous clients, Jamila Bouhired, B-O-U-H-I-R-E-D, whose story is immortalized in the film of the Battle of Algiers, had been arrested for bombing a milk bar frequented by Europeans in Algiers. When Bouhired stood trial in 1957, Vergès never denied the charges against her. Instead, he introduced what he called the strategy of disruption, unquote, which was to become his legal trademark and earn him celebrity status in France. The French colonialists were the real criminals, Vergès argued, and should be indicted for countless atrocities. Bouhired laughed out loud in court when the death sentence was pronounced. Her punishment was later commuted to life in prison, and she was freed the same year the French withdrew from Algeria. Vergès used the strategy of disruption earlier this year when he defended George Ibrahim Abdallah, the 36-year-old leader of the Lebanese armed revolutionary faction. Abdallah, formerly a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, was convicted for the 1982 murders in Paris of an American military attaché and an Israeli embassy official. Abdallah used the forum of the courtroom to denounce American imperialists and their Zionist guard dogs like Bouhired. He laughed when he learned of his sentence, life in prison. To this day, Vergès is determined never to let the French forget their brutal role in Algeria, and he intends to raise the issue once again in defending Klaus Barbie. 1 million Algerians were killed by the French, he says. If you want to judge Barbie, then you must also judge yourself.
After Algerian independence in 1962, Vergès moved to Algiers, converted to Islam, changed his name to Jacques Mansour, M-A-N-S-O-U-R, and in 1963 married his former client, Jamila Bouhired. The couple went to China for their honeymoon and, according to Erna Paris, were, quote, cordially received by Chairman Mao. Vergès returned to Algeria a full-fledged Maoist. Given his passionate commitment to Arab nationalism, few were surprised when Vergès authored a book extolling the Palestinian cause entitled For the Fedayeen. After Israel defeated the Arabs in 1967, a mood of desperate militancy swept through the misery-ridden Palestinian refugee camps. With Palestinians deprived of a homeland since 1948 and faced with an enemy that had spurned repeated offers to negotiate, the Palestine Liberation Organization decided to escalate its tactics. Yasser Arafat's al-Fatah, the most powerful group under the PLO umbrella, joined other Palestinian groups in seeking aid from non-Arab sources, including the Soviet Union. The Soviets responded cautiously, while China began sending sizable arms shipments. The arms from Beijing were not enough, though, to sustain a protracted military struggle. PLO leaders felt they couldn't afford to turn down any offers of help, no matter how unsavory the donors. Here, François Junot and his neo-Nazi colleagues sprang into action. In April 1969, the New European Order, a Lausanne-based neo-Nazi umbrella organization, met in Barcelona. According to Le Monde correspondent Jean-Claude Bourrère, who is the world's leading Junot watcher, Junot played a role in planning the event, which attracted 50 delegates from Europe and Latin America, as well as a representative from al-Fatah. Several delegates pledged to assist the PLO by supplying money, men, and training. After the conference, Junot began selling weapons to various Palestinian factions and advising them on how to invest the large sums of money that were pouring in. His closest relations were with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a far-left faction led by Dr. George Habash, which jumped into the headlines around the world in the late 1960s by hijacking several commercial jets. 3 of Habash's men were captured during an attack on an El Al airplane in Zurich in February 1969. According to a 1984 documentary, The Other Face of Terror, when the case was tried later that year, François Jeannot helped pay their legal costs. Throughout the proceedings, he sat next to the defendants and conferred with their legal advisor, his old friend Jacques Vergès. The first public alliance between the old guard Nazi banker and the brilliant anti-colonialist lawyer was a concrete premonition of the slogan the third position would adopt several years later. Hitler and Mao were indeed united in struggle.
Within days after the PFLP members were convicted in February of 1970, Jacques Vergès dropped completely out of sight. Just as suddenly, he reappeared in Paris 8 years later. I stepped through the looking glass, he says in Unhealed Wounds, where I served an apprenticeship. His apprenticeship over, Vergès resumed his law practice in Paris and in 1982 took on a new case with a Jeannot connection. Vergès represented unsuccessfully, as it turned out, two members of the clandestine organization run by Carlos, the infamous Venezuelan terrorist. Bruno Breguet, a Swiss citizen who had worked with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Magdalena Kopp, an ex-member of the West German left-wing Baader-Meinhof group, had been accused of plotting to blow up a busy cafe on the Champs-Élysées. Breguet professed to be a left-wing revolutionary, but he was a longtime friend of François Jeannot. When Breguet was captured during a PFLP bombing mission in Israel in 1970 and sentenced to a 15-year jail term, Jeannot organized a successful campaign to have him freed after 7 years. In the early 1980s, Vergès continued to display his political ambidexterity. He began editing a journal of armed resistance, unquote, called Correspondance Internationale, which published lengthy communiques from imprisoned comrades, unquote, of the Italian left brigades and other left-wing terrorist groups. He took on as a client Frédéric Aurillac, a member of the Paris-based Direct Action, a far-left group that had attacked Jewish targets in France to protest the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And he granted a sympathetic interview to a Spanish neo-Nazi magazine, which was reprinted in Cobra, a newsletter for right-wing political prisoners in the United States and Europe, published by the Paris-based European National Fascists, or FNE. In the fall of 1980, the FNE machine-gunned 5 Jewish cultural buildings in Paris and claimed responsibility for bombing the Rue Copernic synagogue, an attack that killed 4 and wounded 24. For more on the French ultra-right, see Lord of the Books, page 53. While Vergès was pursuing his mysterious apprenticeship between 1970 and 78, François Jeannot continued to use the Palestinians to further his own anti-Jewish agenda. In Geneva, Jeannot became friendly with Ali Hassan Salameh, the leader of Black September, the organization that murdered 9 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympics in Munich. When Salameh needed medical attention, Jeannot arranged for him to be treated at a private clinic in Lausanne. In 1974, PLO chief Yasser Arafat denounced international terrorism and declared his commitment to seeking a negotiated settlement, establishing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. These steps toward moderation, which were strongly supported by the Soviets, triggered the schism that persists today within the PLO, as George Habash's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and a host of Syrian, Libyan, and Iraqi-based factions ruled out any compromise with Israel. A bloody internal conflict began pitting Arafat loyalists against members of the so-called rejectionist front.
Not surprisingly, Jeannot and his neo-Nazi colleagues favored those Arab groups calling for the annihilation of the Jewish state. But Jeannot's erstwhile friend, Ali Hassan Salameh, aligned himself with the Arafat forces. As al-Fatah's security chief, Salameh repudiated his former terrorist activities and began warning Western intelligence services, including the CIA, of plots by rival Palestinian groups. Salameh also shared information with European governments regarding links between their own domestic terrorists and Arab extremists. In January 1979, Salameh was assassinated by an Israeli hit squad in Beirut, presumably as revenge for his earlier role with Black September. Whatever the real motive, his death served to undermine the position of moderates in the PLO as well as in Israel, while bolstering the hardliners in both camps, including the Israeli leadership who, in the words of former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, viewed the Palestinians as, quote, two-legged animals, unquote, worthy of extinction. Among the hardliners in the Arab camp is the Palestine Liberation Front. PLF, a Tunis-based organization headed by Muhammad Abu Abbas. Abbas is best known for masterminding the Achille Lauro hijacking in 1985, much to the embarrassment of Yasser Arafat. Although news of the Achille Lauro incident was splashed widely across U.S. newspapers and beamed nightly via television into U.S. living rooms, the major U.S. news media never reported an intriguing part of the story. Included on the PLF's list of prisoners to be exchanged for the Achille Lauro hostages was the name of Ottfried Hepp, H-E-P-P, then one of West Germany's most wanted neo-Nazi terrorists. Quote, "I know Hepp quite well," Abbas told the French daily Liberation in 1985. "He is a friend. I do not consider him to be a Nazi. On the contrary, he is a militant anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist and a supporter of the Palestinian cause." The 28-year-old Hepp was arrested in Paris on April 8, 1985, while entering an apartment inhabited by a leading member of the PLF. He was convicted of possessing weapons and false identification papers and was extradited earlier this year to West Germany, where he has been charged with organizing a series of bombings against U.S. military bases.
Hepp's saga as a terrorist began in the late 1970s when he underwent paramilitary training with the neo-Nazi Hoffmann Group at a castle near Nuremberg. The Hoffmann Group, which had participated in joint maneuvers with neo-Nazis from several European countries, was banned after police raided the castle in February of 1980 and seized a huge cache of explosives, automatic weapons, uniforms, poisonous chemicals, anti-aircraft guns, and a tank, all supplied by sympathizers inside the West German army. Later that year, a Hoffmann graduate blew himself up while planning a bomb at Munich's Oktoberfest celebration. A final body count of 11 dead and 200 injured made it the worst terrorist incident in post-war Germany. Hepp was briefly imprisoned in 1981 for distributing Nazi propaganda and inciting racial hatred. While in jail, he sent a letter to Berlin's leftist newspaper, Die Tageszeitung, bitterly denouncing the United States. "The minds and souls of people here in the West are in the process of stultification," said Hepp, whose letter ended, quote, "forward in the anti-imperialist struggle." In a prison interview with Die Welt, he added, "We think everyone is justified in this struggle. We only have a chance if the rightists and the leftists come together." Not long after Hepp was released from prison, other neo-Nazi cadres began attacking NATO installations and discotheques that catered to American servicemen. 2 GIs and an Egyptian national were killed in June of 1982 when a neo-Nazi gunman burst into a Nuremberg disco and opened fire on the crowd. Hepp led a gang that unleashed a spate of terror bombings in late 1982 at 4 U.S. Army bases in West Germany, Eschborn, Darmstadt, Butzbach, and Feckenheim. Initially, it was widely assumed by press and government officials that left-wing terrorists, either the Red Army faction or the revolutionary cells, were behind the bombings, but a police investigation showed otherwise. In February of 1983, 3 of Hepp's Kameraden were arrested in Frankfurt. According to Rand Corporation analyst Bruce Hoffman, by this time Hepp had escaped to England where he was safe housed by British Nazis. From there, he traveled to Damascus and the Syrian-controlled Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. During this period, according to the French magazine Le Point, Hepp worked with George Habash's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. His next stop was Tunis, where he earned a salary of $500 a month working for the Abu Abbas group, and then in 1984, he surfaced in France.
For the better part of a year, Hepp circulated among the international terrorist underground in Paris. While in Paris, he had contacts not only with Arab terrorists and neo-Nazi fugitives, but also with indigenous left-wing organizations such as Direct Action, the Belgian-based Communist Combatant Cells, and West Germany's Red Army faction. This far-left trio issued a joint communique in January 1985 announcing the formation of a united, quote, political military front, unquote, to wage revolutionary war in Europe, with NATO as its principal target. According to Bruce Hoffman, Hepp is suspected of having participated in the 1984 bombing of the Rhine-Main Air Force Base, a U.S. installation in Frankfurt, West Germany. 2 U.S. servicemen were wounded in the attack, which has been attributed by the German press to leftists. He is also a suspect in the 1985 bombing of the Marks and Spencer department store in Paris and the Cinema Rivoli Beaubourg, where a Jewish film festival was being shown. Responsibility for the latter attack was claimed by Direct Action. Apparently Direct Action and its left-wing partners did not fear being manipulated by the likes of Ottfried Hepp. In recent years, terrorists have attacked NATO bases and U.S. military personnel in Spain, Portugal, Holland, Italy, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as well as in France and West Germany. Ascertaining who is responsible for these attacks is complicated by the blurring of distinctions between left, and far right. The ultras have much in common psychologically. Both attract impatient, apocalyptic individuals who seek to right deep-rooted wrongs by setting a timer or pulling a trigger. But there are also significant differences between the two extremes. Neo-Nazi terrorists are part of an extensive international network dating back to World War II, a network sustained in part during the Cold War by a U.S. government obsessed with anti-Sovietism. François Junot's friends Karl Wolff, Scarface Skorzeny, and Klaus Barbie, who spied on leftists for U.S. intelligence in the immediate post-war years, and whom the U.S. helped to relocate to Bolivia in 1951, were among the hundreds of Nazis used by the U.S. intelligence after the war.
This last paragraph I'm going to reread because this is one of the most important points, and we haven't had much interpretive discussion. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about it once we finish, when we almost are finished. But there are also significant differences between the two extremes, meaning the ultra-right and the ultra-left. Neo-Nazi terrorists are part of an extensive international network dating back to World War II, a network sustained in part during the Cold War by a U.S. government obsessed with anti-Sovietism. François Junot's friends Karl Wolff, Scarface Skorzeny, and Klaus Barbie, who spied on leftists for U.S. intelligence in the immediate post-war years and who the U.S. helped to relocate to Bolivia in 1951, were among the hundreds of Nazis used by U.S. intelligence during the war. Western Europe's far-left terrorists, on the other hand, make up tiny cults bereft of grassroots support and are scorned by nearly everyone, especially by the mass left movements in Europe that are committed to social change through nonviolent means. Enfeebled by arrests and informants, Direct Action and other European desperados are more concerned with day-to-day survival than ideological purity. Imprisoned by their own actions, they are living proof of what philosopher George Santayana's axiom, fanaticism consists in redoubling your efforts when you've forgotten your aim, unquote. A report issued by the European Parliament in 1985 cites an alarming growth throughout the continent of racist and xenophobic attitudes which, quote, create a fertile breeding ground for white right-wing extremism, unquote. Disaffected working-class youths, the report noted, are ripe targets for neo-Nazi recruitment, particularly during times of high unemployment and economic recession. That last sentence again also, because this is important. Disaffected working-class youths, the report noted, are ripe targets for neo-Nazi recruitment, particularly during times of high unemployment and economic recession. The danger is exacerbated by the nefarious alliance of the far left and the far right, which presents strategic opportunities for neo-Nazi militants to manipulate authentic desires for peace and self-determination in Europe. And with a rise in neo-Nazi recruitment comes the very real threat of a rise in terrorist activity. The Reagan administration, however, still points to Moscow as terror central, thus giving a green light to the right-wingers who kill innocent civilians and attack U.S. installations. And it may get worse in the days ahead. Those last couple of sentences again, too, I think they apply even more now than they did a year ago. The Reagan administration, however, still points to Moscow as terror central, thus giving a green light to the right-wingers who kill innocent civilians and attack U.S. installations. And it may get worse in the days ahead. The whole of Europe, from Stockholm to Naples, must know about each American who was killed within 48 hours of the event, says Jean Thiriard, a leading Belgian neo-Nazi. European unity will only come about more or less when 200 or 300 American occupiers are killed in every corner of Europe, just to prove our point. There will be no going back. And in an interesting sidebar to this particular article, it's called The Lord of the Books, dealing with French ultra-right-wing publishing. This again by the same authors. Jean-Gilles Malliarkis, Malliarkis, the self-described Orthodox pagan who heads the MNR, that's the National Revolutionary Movement, apologizes for the lack of a sign on the door, but precautions are necessary. The boisterous MNR youth who caused a stir last year by carrying a Free Klaus Barbie poster at a public rally are not exactly the toast of Paris. This obviously is an ultra-right-wing group. We sit down, and Malliarkis proudly shows us his new book, a lengthy denunciation of the Yalta Accords. A burly ex-world-class athlete in his mid-40s, Mayorkas holds both superpowers in contempt. Reagan is a dangerous clown, he declares. America and Russia are the same. Emulating the Italian third position, our host speaks of la troisième voie, the third way that will rescue France from the Atlantic system without becoming a Soviet satellite, unquote. During the hour-long conversation, our eyes darted to the book-lined shelves. Finally, we get a literary tour. One section features such Nazi classics as Mein Kampf. There is a stack of no-Holocaust literature highlighted by the works of Robert Faurisson, F-A-U-R-I-S-S-O-N, a French revisionist who denies the existence of Hitler's gas chambers. We also find contributions to this genre published by a tiny, far-left circle in Paris known as the Old Mole Group. There's even a comic book that claims the Holocaust never happened. There are a lot of things that I'm sure Nip and I will comment on about this particular article, because there are a lot of things to be underscored. It should be noted that among the champions of Robert Faurisson among progressive American political circles is none other than Noam Chomsky, the noted author and lecturer. So bear that in mind against the background of the third position.
Indeed, and while we won't spend a great deal of time talking about Noam Chomsky tonight, we did have somebody call while we were taking our musical break and asked for some information, and we have talked about him before. And of course, this is one of the very strange things about Noam Chomsky's career, is his support of Robert Faurisson and the use of a Chomsky introduction on one of Faurisson's books. One of the interesting things that I wanted to note, especially because it came from the mouth of a very interesting, very enigmatic man, that being Jacques Vergès, the Paris lawyer that the French lawyer that we've talked about so much tonight, was Vergès' statement that he had gone through the looking glass and served an apprenticeship. And this was fairly recently after, or fairly soon after, he had first made contact with François Janot and the rest of the group. And I was thinking about that, and they mentioned that Jacques Vergès is a chess player and a philosopher and things of this sort. And I was thinking about, of course, the obvious analogy for going through the looking glass is Alice in Wonderland. But I stopped and thought about it, and one of the things that's most significant is when you stand and look at yourself in a looking glass, when you look at something that's like your left hand, for instance, you look at the figure in the mirror and it appears to be the right hand. That's the interesting thing about looking glasses, is when you've gone through the looking glass, everything that had seemed left before turns out to be right. So maybe Mr. Vergès was giving us a little hint about who exactly he went to serve his apprenticeship.
This on the subject, by the way, of his 8-year disappearance. He simply dropped out of sight for 8 years and then later reappeared. Well, there are a number of things to be ruminated on about the third position of fascism. First of all, this is not a new event in the history of fascism. As we mentioned at the top of the broadcast, the German Nazi Party itself had an explicit wing. Not only was the German Nazi Party called the German National Socialist Workers' Party to attract disaffected left-wingers, but specifically in the early history of the Nazi Party, there was a wing of that party headed by Gregor Strasser, S-T-R-A-S-S-E-R, which was explicitly designed for attracting disaffected left-wingers, and which sought a position, although it rejected Marxism per se, they still sought to overthrow, quote, bourgeois society. Beyond that, I think it's quite clear from the text of Coogan and Lee's article that the third position fascists today obviously play very nicely into the hands of the exponents of the strategy of tension in the various parts of the world where they are putting that into practice. Not only Italy, but as we looked at in connection with in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal in Radio Free America shows 32 and 34, the strategy of tension appears to have been one of the things that Oliver North and company may have been intending to use with regard to precipitating war in Central America, using the Lepenka bombing and the proposed bomb assassination of U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Tams, but also quite possibly precipitating fascism and martial law in the United States under the Rex 84 martial law plan. Recall earlier the connection between Oliver North, the alleged target of Abu Nidal's and Gaddafi's terrorist moves of the past week, and the connection again between Abu Nidal, Abu Abbas, whose group hijacked the Achille Lauro and who was hooked up with Ottfried Hepp, the German neo-Nazi who was one of the prisoners to be exchanged for the Achille Lauro people, and their connections with Monzer el-Kassar and Oliver North. Again, it's an interesting thing to contemplate. Those who would like to used the strategy of tension, as Stefano Della Chia dubbed it, basically the old strategy of provocation, setting up a terrorist incident, blaming it on your opponent, and using it to justify either military expansionism abroad or a crackdown on civil liberties at home. Even though the neo-Nazis themselves may have been right-wing, their anti-American and violently anti-American sentiments and their willingness to merge themselves with people like Direct Action, PLO, PFLP, and others obviously fits very, very nicely into the strategy of tension. And in Radio Free America show number 19, we took a look at the ambiguity of Italian terrorism, in which the right-wing P2 and the Secret Services were manipulating terror of both the right and left, often giving prospective terrorists their choice of which side of the fence they chose to work.
Yes, the phrase that often is used, and that springs time to time again to mind, is useful idiots. It's nice to have sincere believers who think that they're striking a blow to direct instigation, although they may not know it, of that same imperialist overculture.
It's also interesting to reflect on efforts by the far right in this country to penetrate more progressive organizations. Again, the Camp Hobbit, the organic food, the ecological concerns, the views on women's rights and so forth, while admirable in and of themselves, should be viewed here more the way one would look at an SS platoon putting camouflage uniforms and pieces of brush in their helmets. They may look like they're going to blend in with the surroundings. They may look very greened, in fact. However, that is not a very good indication to their social attitudes.
That's right. Green is also the color of putrescence. We're going to take a break on that pleasant thought, and we are going to come back and take your telephone call.